Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. We've got something really special lined up for you today. We're going to be talking about Helen Suzman. Now, you've probably heard of Nelson Mandela, right? But do you know about this incredible woman who stood right beside him in the fight against apartheid? A white Jewish woman in a parliament dominated by white Afrikaner men who believed in segregation. Sisman's story is one that I think a lot of people don't know, and it's a story of real courage, persistence, and standing up for what's right, even when it's, well, incredibly unpopular.
Yeah, it's really amazing when you think about the context. Apartheid in South Africa wasn't just a few laws. It was a whole system built to oppress the non-white majority. And Helen Suzman, she spent decades challenging that system from within. It's pretty remarkable.
So let's start at the beginning. Our sources detail Sisman's early life. She was born in 1917 to Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Russia. Do you think that, experiencing that kind of discrimination, even if it was through her parents, shaped her sense of justice later on?
Oh, for sure. Seeing the effects of discrimination firsthand, even indirectly, definitely could have planted those seeds of activism in her. I mean, she went on to study economics and economic history, even lecturing at the University of Witwatersrand, got married to Dr. Moses Suzman. They had two daughters, but it was her work with the South African Institute of Race Relations that really threw her into the deep end, so to speak.
Yeah, the Institute had her prepare evidence for the Fagan Commission, which was investigating how apartheid laws were impacting Black South Africans. Would you say that this was her first real, up close and personal experience with the brutality of apartheid?
Absolutely. I mean, the Fagan Commission was a major turning point for Suzman. Imagine, right? She's going through all this evidence, hearing these stories from people directly affected by the injustices of apartheid. It was a huge wake-up call for her, and it really fueled her desire to make a change. And that experience basically propels her into politics.
So she's elected to Parliament in 1953 as a member of the United Party, representing Houghton in Johannesburg. And that same year, the Separate Amenities Act is introduced, which was basically trying to segregate all public facilities based on race. It sounds like she was thrown right into the fire. What was the political scene like back then? Did her party support this bill?
Oh, yeah, the Separate Amenities Act. That was a big part of the whole apartheid plan, It was all about separating people in every part of their lives.
Hmm.
And this is where we really see Suzan's courage. Her own party, the United Party, was actually in favor of the bill, but she was completely against it. She even walked out of the House in protest. Can you imagine going against your own party like that, especially on such a major issue?
That's a huge move for someone just starting their political career. It really shows the kind of person she was, not afraid to stand up for what she believed in, even when it meant standing alone.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a symbolic thing either. She understood what the Separate Amenities Act would really mean. It wasn't just about separate benches or bathrooms. It was about making an entire population feel less than human, about reinforcing this idea that one race was better than others. She was drawing a line in the sand by opposing it.
And so, because of her strong beliefs, she ends up leaving the United Party and helps to create the Progressive Party in 1959, a party that believed in equal rights for all South Africans, regardless of race. This seems like a natural step for her, given how against apartheid she was. But what kind of pushback did this new party face? I mean, it was a whole different political climate back then.
Oh, the Progressive Party had a really tough time. South African politics were totally controlled by the National Party, the guys who created apartheid, and they had a really tight grip on power. The Progressive Party's ideas, wanting a multiracial democratic South Africa, that was seen as extreme, even dangerous by a lot of people. They were a small, new party going up against a giant. But they had Suzman. She was a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, and then came the 1961 election where the Progressive Party lost every single seat except for one, Helen Suzman's. She was the only voice of opposition in the South African parliament for the next 13 years. That's a crazy amount of responsibility for one person to carry.
Wow, think about that. She was basically a one-woman show going head-to-head with a regime that wanted to shut down anyone who disagreed with them. The pressure, the isolation, the constant attacks, they must have been intense. But she didn't back down. She used everything she had, debates, questions, amendments, to challenge the government at every single turn.
Those parliamentary sessions must have been something else with her constantly pushing back against the norm. Would you say she was more confrontational, or was there a strategy to how she interacted with the ruling party?
She was famous for her wit, really sharp, And she can really expose how ridiculous apartheid was just by using logic and well-placed jabs. She wasn't afraid to criticize anyone, even directly challenging prime ministers like Hendrik Verwoerd and P.W. Botha, and she often used humor to highlight how contradictory and unfair their policies were.
So it sounds like she really knew how to use language to her advantage in that
Oh,
setting.
totally. She treated Parliament like a stage, and she was a master at using it. Her speeches were elegant, her arguments sharp, and her wit disarming. She knew exactly how to get under the skin of those in power, making them defend their policies, which were impossible to defend. And in a time when censorship was everywhere, her words in Parliament, those couldn't be silenced.
It's like that famous quote she's known for. It is not my questions that embarrass South Africa, it is your answers.
Yeah, exactly. She understood that just asking the right questions was a powerful way to bring injustice to light and make those in charge accountable. And the media couldn't ignore her. Her speeches were always making news, keeping the spotlight on the awful things happening under apartheid.
So she was using her position not only to fight against laws, but to raise awareness on a bigger scale, both within South Africa and around the world.
Exactly. She was brilliant at using parliamentary privilege to get around government censorship. She was getting information about the abuses of apartheid out to the media and the world. She was like a constant thorn in the side of the regime, always poking and prodding and showing everyone their hypocrisy. But her work wasn't limited to just Parliament.
We're going to dive into that in just a sec, but first, you were saying that Suzman's work went beyond Parliament. What else was she doing?
Suzman was really committed to seeing the real human impact of apartheid. So she would visit prisons a lot, like even Robben Island, where Mandela and other political prisoners were kept. She wanted to see the conditions for herself. She'd document everything and then push for improvements, fight for the rights of the people in prison there.
It's almost hard to picture, going from these formal parliamentary debates to the harsh reality of those prisons. Do you think she actually made any real changes to those conditions?
Oh yeah, those visits weren't just for show. She used her position to get people talking about how awful those prisons were. That put pressure on the government to do something. And she didn't just watch, she actually took action, like helping prisoners get lawyers, making sure they could communicate with their families, and sometimes even stepping in to make sure individuals were treated better.
It's interesting because Mandela, in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, he specifically talks about those visits from Suzman. He says they brought a little bit of hope into a really dark place.
Right. That really says something about the impact she had. Even though Mandela called her a constant thorn in the side of the authorities, he really respected her dedication to justice, even though they didn't always agree on how to get there.
Which brings us to something you mentioned earlier. Suzman was against the economic sanctions placed on South Africa. And that wasn't something the ANC agreed with, right? Why was she opposed to them?
The whole sanctions thing was really complicated. People who supported sanctions, they argued that putting economic pressure on the government was the only way to make them get rid of apartheid. They thought isolating South Africa would ultimately help black South Africans. But Suzman, she thought sanctions would end up hurting the people they were supposed to help. She thought they'd cause more poverty and unemployment. She was worried that sanctions would actually strengthen the government's control.
So it sounds like she was being practical, looking at the bigger picture, and thinking about the unintended consequences. Her economics background probably played a big role in how she saw things.
Oh, absolutely. Her knowledge of economics definitely gave her a different perspective. She understood that there weren't any easy answers to complex problems. And she was also a little bit wary of other countries interfering in South Africa's business. She thought real change had to come from within.
Her relationship with the ANC seems pretty complex. She didn't support some of their strategies. She was even critical of Mandela sometimes. But then in 1997, Mandela gave her the Order for Meritorious Service, a pretty clear sign of respect for her role in the fight against apartheid. How can we make sense of those seemingly opposite views?
I think it shows how complex the whole anti-apartheid movement really was. It wasn't just one big group with everyone agreeing on everything. People had different ideas about the best way to do things, and there were lots of debates about strategies.
So even though everyone wanted to end apartheid, there were disagreements on the best way to get there.
Right, exactly. And Suzman, she was always true to herself. She wasn't afraid to say what she thought, even if it meant going against popular opinion. She was independent, always guided by her own beliefs and what she saw happening around her.
That independent streak, her willingness to challenge even the people she agreed with, that seems like a constant in her life.
Yeah, that's true. Leaving the United Party, standing alone in Parliament for 13 years, arguing against sanctions even when it was unpopular. Suzman always did things her own way. Her conscience was her guide. Her belief in justice and her practical approach to solving problems, that's what drove her.
It's a good lesson for all of us to think for ourselves, question what we believe, and not just follow the crowd, even when it's for a cause we care about.
Totally. Suzman's life shows us how important it is to think independently, to challenge what we're told, and to be brave enough to stand up for what we believe in, even when we're alone. It reminds us that fighting for social change is never simple or easy. There will always be disagreements, different approaches, and changes in strategy.
But what matters is keeping your eye on the prize, even when the path to get there is complicated.
Exactly. For Suzman, that prize was ending apartheid and creating a South Africa that was just and fair. And she never gave up on that, even when things were difficult.
It's inspiring, isn't it, to think about how one person can make such a huge difference just by standing up for what they believe in.
It really is. Suzman's story reminds us that we don't have to wait for someone else to tell us what to do. We can all find ways to contribute, to speak out, and to make the world better.
As we wrap up our look at Suzman's life, what are the main things we should take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is this. Every time someone is brave enough to stand up against injustice, every time someone speaks out, it adds to a larger movement for change.
It's like that quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
And Helen Suzman is a perfect example of that.
What can we learn from her that goes beyond the fight against apartheid? How can we use what we learned from her story to face the problems we have in our own lives and the world today?
That's a great question. And it's one we're going to dig into a little deeper after a short.
So we were talking about all the things Suzman did. Her incredible courage, how she used her position in Parliament so effectively, and how committed she was to fighting for justice. But what can we take away from her story that applies to our lives today? I mean, we're not facing something as terrible as apartheid, right?
Right. But the way she approached things is still relevant, even if our problems seem smaller. She was dealing with something huge, but she broke it down into pieces and focused on what she could actually change. Suzman was great at making those little changes, chipping away at apartheid little by little, without losing sight of the big goal.
So she didn't let herself get overwhelmed by the whole thing. She just focused on what she could do, the things she could actually make a difference in.
Exactly. Take her visits to Robben Island, for example. She knew she couldn't just tear down the entire prison system by herself, but she could try to make things better for those prisoners, make sure people heard their stories, and show everyone how wrong it was. And those little things she did, over time, they helped to change people's minds and put pressure on the government.
It just shows you that you don't need to do something huge to make a change. Sometimes the most important things are those small, consistent efforts that might not seem like much on their own, but together they can really build up and make a difference.
I agree. It's about figuring out what you're passionate about and where your skills can be used to address the problems you care about. Suzman was an economist, so she used that knowledge when she was thinking about sanctions. She was also really affected by the human suffering caused by apartheid, so she focused on prison reform and helping individual people. What are you passionate about? What skills do you have that you could use to help?
It's like a call to action, right? Look around your community, see where there's injustice, and find a way to get involved, even if it's just a small thing.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to wait for someone else to lead the way. Suzman showed us that even one person speaking out, consistently and strategically, can have a big impact.
Her story really shows us that courage isn't always about making big speeches or doing something heroic. It's about showing up every day and doing the hard work, even when it's not appreciated and even when people are against you.
And it's about staying true to yourself, even when it's unpopular, even when it means disagreeing with people who are on your side. Suzman never abandoned her principles, even when it caused conflict with others in the anti-apartheid movement.
She followed her own path, guided by her belief in justice and equality. That's incredibly inspiring. It makes you realize that we all have the power to make a difference, to stand up for what we believe in, and to make the world a better place.
Yeah, well said. Helen Suzman's legacy isn't just about ending apartheid. It's about the power of one person to create change, challenge the way things are, and fight for justice no matter how hard it is.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life of this remarkable woman, we'll leave you with this thought. How are you going to use Suzman's example of courage, persistence, and dedication to justice in your own life? What kind of impact are you going to make on the world?